Howdy folks. So in this video we're going to talk about promises in JavaScript. Promises are essentially used to defer an action until we get a response from something. Often on the front end that's an API call. So in the case of we call an API, we want to defer responding to the API until we actually have the data back. And one of the ways that we originally did that was using callbacks. So a callback would look something along the lines of we have some fetch API. Let's just say fetch API, and then we would actually have a result callback, right? And actually, you can see that pretty clearly in the file system API. So in this case, this callback would not be called until fetch is done getting this API. And the reason we do that is because we don't want to necessarily block the program execution. The reason for that is JavaScript is built for the browser, where when you are waiting on something, the user might still be doing things on the page. They might be clicking things. They might be moving their mouse around. Buttons might need to be showing hover states, etc. So the browser doesn't want to freeze when you go and do something that might take a long time. So requesting an API could take up to 30 seconds. You don't want your web page to be completely unresponsive for those 30 seconds. Your user will click a button. You'll call the API. They'll try to click something else. It won't work. They might stay 3 more seconds on your page. If nothing works, they're going to close it and never come back. So what they did is they added this idea of asynchronous execution. So what asynchronous means is as soon as you start something that needs to be asynchronous, JavaScript will kick that off, and then it will just happily continue on to the next piece. To give you an example of that, let me show you what that would look like. So if I create a set timeout, let's actually do this. Log before timeout, and then let's do a set timeout with a callback function inside timeout, and let's set it for 100 milliseconds. Set. If I save this, oh boy. Yeah, that's fine. So if we run this, you can see the before timeout and then after timeout is set fires. So we're not waiting for this set timeout to finish. We're not waiting that 100 milliseconds. That happens after. And that's because if you set a timeout, you wouldn't want to necessarily block your entire web page from taking any actions at all until that timeout is done, because that would be a bad user experience. So that's what we do. We use callbacks. And so we pass a callback, and that callback essentially tells JavaScript, hey, when you're done with this action that I just told you to take, call this function that I gave you. So as you can see, once the timeout fires, this function in here will run and print that out. So let's say that we're actually using this to do web requests. Now, it's not out of the question to have a lot of web requests. And you might be wondering, well, what's the problem with the timeout? There's nothing wrong with the timeout, right? It shows, I understand it. I've got a function here. It calls that function as soon as it does the thing, right? Well, let's look at an example here. So this, we have our call API, which takes in the API to call, and then a callback function, which returns the data. So this callback function is not fired until the API returns. You might notice here I have a couple of these. Well, what this is the example I've got here is a business tracking application, a project tracking application. Now, project tracking applications can be extremely complicated, and they can have a tremendous amount of different structure. So in this case, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to log in. That's going to get us a user ID. Then we're going to ask for the settings, which we couldn't do before we had the user ID. So this callback API or call API has to be inside the callback for the first API because it relies on data from that. It relies on the user ID. The next thing we need to do is get our organizations in the project management system. We couldn't do that until we had the settings because we need this load all orgs property. to know if we need to load all organizations or just a single one. Once we get those organizations, we need to load the business units in there, which we can't do until we have the ID of the organization. We can get the pillars from the business unit ID, which we couldn't do until we loaded that. We can get the teams in the pillar, which we couldn't do until we had the pillars. We can get the projects on the team, which we couldn't do until we knew what those teams were because we need the ID. And then we can get the assigned project members, which we couldn't do until we knew the project. So if I run this, whoopsie, promises, no promise.js. Uh-oh. There we go. All right, so you can see it does all those things very rapidly, but there's still a little bit of a delay in between them. Now this looks awful. And there's two reasons it looks awful. One, because if I'm looking at this, it just kind of turns into a blur of stuff. And I've got a lot of callbacks. Callback, 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 callback. And if I even scroll down here, which one of these end curly brace parentheses semicolon goes to which callback? I have no idea. This gets worse if each of these functions is really long and these are really far apart. We call this callback hell. Just a bunch of callbacks one after another. And this is probably a slightly simplified example. In most major size applications, you're going to be calling a lot more APIs just to get off the ground, and it's very likely that some of those APIs can't be called until other ones have returned their data. Like we saw here. I can't just come up and say, get me the assigned project members, because I have no idea what my project is. And I'm not going to know that till I get the projects, till I get the teams, the pillars, the business units, the organizations, the settings, the user. All of these are necessary to do in step. Well, this isn't very pretty. So what we did instead is we came up with the idea of a promise. And a promise is kind of similar to this in that it also has some callback that needs to be set, but it's chainable. So back to my test file, if I wanted to turn this into a promise, first I would wrap it in a function. I would say, like, I'm going to call this sleep. And I'm going to pass a certain number of seconds that I want to sleep into it. Right? Now, normally what I would do there is I would say, okay, let's sleep here, and let's call this callback at the end. And then I do a set timeout, seconds times 1,000. Why am I doing seconds times 1,000? Because set timeout uses milliseconds, not seconds, so I have to convert it. So what this will do, if I say sleep 5, well, let's go at 1. And then I do this, and I change my console log, done sleeping. It does similar to what we had before. Now, if I want to sleep again at this point, let's say I want to sleep another 0.1 seconds, I have to do another callback, right? console.log, done sleeping twice. If I run this, you can see I have my before timeout, after timeout is set, done sleeping, which is this first one, and then done sleeping twice. This is also susceptible to that callback hell. So how do we use promises with this? Well, what a promise does, promises are a specific type of object. So if I say const promise equals new promise, log, and I log this promise. Notice the new here. This is similar to the classes that we're learning about. If I run this, oops, resolve run the file. That makes sense. Promises require a callback function, or you need them to pass a function. And you can see here it says, hey, I didn't like this. Now if I run it, promise pending. So that's this particular log, this one in here. Pending means that it's still unresolved. So promises can be in 3 states. Pending, which is when you first create them. Then they become resolved when we resolve them, or they become rejected if there is an error. So we'll go over those in a little detail. So in here, I can say inside the promise function. And if I run that, you can see before timeout, after timeout, and then this actually gets called immediately, whatever function is in here. And then this log. Well, that's not very useful. What would be the point of that? What's the point of this function being called immediately as soon as I create the promise? Well, the reason is this promise is meant to actually handle things that take callbacks. So if I put my sleep in here, so if I sleep for 0.1, it has a special function, resolve. And if I put resolve in here, so let's do this console.log, inside promise, and I run that, no difference yet. But now let's look at the actual magic of a promise. Promise.resolve, or then, sorry. And then if I put this in here, promise is resolved. Resolved. I'm actually going to get rid of these just because they're a little confusing. Okay, so now if I run this, you see a couple things. First of all, we get our inside promise. This happens immediately because this function is run immediately. Then I get my promise pending, this console log. This function doesn't run yet, right? So you notice, yeah, this doesn't run, and then afterwards, it resolves. So to show you a little bit more what's happening, let me do it like this. I'm going to say, okay, log sleep is over. Now if I run this, inside promise, okay, so this happens first. Then after this, this happens. So it runs straight through here, gets to here. Then a tenth of a second later, our sleep is over, so we hit this console log. And then immediately afterwards, we hit our then. So what's happening here? Essentially, as soon as you call resolve, whatever callback you pass in here gets fired, without exception. And that's kind of the part of the magic of a promise. And so you create your new promise, you pass this resolve function in, and as soon as you call that resolve function, it'll call a then. And we call this a thenable. This .then is just setting up an event handler. Similar to when you called add event listener in the DOM to say, when I click this, do this thing. The .then is kind of saying, when this promise is finished, then call this callback. So I'm setting up this callback as an event handler, and then I trigger that event by calling the resolve function. So as soon as the sleep is over, I trigger this. Another time you might do a resolve is when your API gets back with data, then you could resolve. So how is this useful? This is even more code than the previous version. Okay, well, let's change our sleep a little bit. So instead of a callback, it returns a promise. So we're going to return new promise, resolve. Then we're going to set timeout inside here, and then we're going to say resolve instead of our callback. So now if we want to do that code that we had before, we can say sleep 0.1 .then console.log sleep is over. Then if we want to do another one, we can actually just return it and then do another .then. Log second sleep is over. Now that's a little odd. So normally you would want to say, okay, well, we're going to do sleep.then like this, and then the console log second sleep is over. And that will work. So if we run this now, you see we get that sleep is over, second sleep is over in relatively quick succession. But this is still just callback hell. We haven't actually fixed anything. So these callbacks have a special property that if you return another promise out of them, you can chain another then. So this sleep returns a promise. So I'll show you that. I could say result equals sleep, console.log result. It's another promise. So I can return that result, and that goes through to the next promise. Now, here's the important part. Once you're inside the promise, you can't really come out. I can't say like, oh, final result equals any of this stuff. Not yet. We'll get to that. Once you're inside a promise, you can never leave a promise. So we return this result. Where does it go? It goes into the next then. Right? So if I return this sleep, this next then only gets called when that sleep is over. So I can put const sleep 2 is over, run it again, and you see it runs the same way. Why is this useful? Well, let's say I want to do it a third time. I just put another then, and I can chain it another time, sleep 3. No indentation. That's where this becomes valuable. Because of the dot then here, it chains on the same level. I don't have to indent it. And that's really the main thing that this got us, is it just made our code look better. This looks better than the indentations. And I'll show you why. So here we have our original promises, right? Call API, call API, call API, call API, all chained, all nested. Well, let's look at what this looks like with promises. Oh, I didn't do it. Okay, let's build this with promises then, since I think that was my intention with this file. So let's say we want to have a call API. Function call API promise, okay? And we're going to pass in an API. Well, the first thing we do is we're going to return a new promise. Promise. And then resolve. It takes that callback function in. And then we're going to call API. But we're going to send resolve as the callback. So before we had to put this callback in, we're just going to use resolve. So now I'm going to say, okay, call API promise dot then user. And then we'll just comment out the rest of this for now. Okay, so what will that do? There's no promises to. Well, it's going to get the user. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to get the settings for the user. So we're going to return this, and then we're going to do a dot then settings, and we're going to say got settings for user. Run that. Oh, it didn't like that. Oh, because I said call API. Call API promise. There we go. And so already you can see we're not having to do another level. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do the rest of these, and I'm going to show you what that looks like when I'm done. All right, all done. So let's take a look at what this looks like. We've got our login, got user, get settings. Now remember, when we return, it chains onto the next then. And actually, this is an important thing too. When you call resolve, so what this would do normally, right, is it would be like API result. And if I say resolve, API result, well, this parameter gets put into the callback. So whatever you put into the resolve here comes out here. In this case, it's the user. So then I call it again. This gets the settings. I call it again to get the organizations. Call it again to get the business units. Again to get the pillars, the teams, the projects, and the project members. Now you can see this looks better. This looks a lot cleaner than this here. We've got this callback tree which starts to slant off to the right. not that it's terrible yet, but if it gets too much more, we're going to start overlapping. Whereas this one is just straight down the line. Okay, well, let's run this then. Uh-oh, there's a problem. User is not defined on line 18. Okay. Oh, and here we go. That's actually true. The user isn't defined on line 18 because it's only defined up here. Now the fact that we're no longer all in the same callback, we get this problem. The user only exists inside this scope, and the settings needs it in here. So what we could do is we could do some clever stuff. We could say, okay, user, we could just put it at the top level. I'm going to change this to result. Result, and then I'm going to say user equals result. What that does is that actually this user exists outside of this callback. Remember your scope. And so if I set result equal to it, that means it exists further on. We run this again. We run to another issue and we get to organizations. Okay, well that's because in here our organizations don't exist. Okay, so then we say, all right, well, let organization. All right, and then we're actually going to say, okay, organization equals organization 0, which honestly we probably should be doing anyway. We change this to organization and this to organization. All right, now we get our units. Oh, we have the same problem with units. Okay, so let unit. All right, and then we say, okay, first of all, we get here, we say unit equals unit 0. So let's put this down here. And then we say unit, and then we say unit. It goes on, breaks again with pillars. It's going to break all the way down. Well, that's kind of annoying because that just means now we have all these variables up here, or we have to do other things. So this is kind of nice as long as none of these inner things need to know about the above variables. Like if we weren't logging the organization ID here, we'd be fine. So all I have to do is if I take out this this 14 part, let's see, where did it break? It broke on pillars. So if I just said teams and close that out, does that gets past the teams? Yep, okay, so now we get down here. We do this as well. And then we do this as well. Ah, well then it works. But we don't have all that data. That data would be nice to have, right? So let's go over promises before I show you how we solve that. We'll just review them. So a promise, what you want to do generally is you create a new promise, and it takes in a callback function. That callback function takes a parameter of resolve. There's another one called reject. If you reject a promise, it has an error. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So what you generally want to do with resolve is you want to do some action, right? Some action like call API, something that takes in a callback. Then, instead of actually doing your callback like you normally would, instead you just call resolve with the data that you would normally be passing into your callback. So you can see here, I actually have given a callback to create API. It's this function here, but I'm just calling resolve inside of it. Then you take your promise and you call .then on it. And the .then function, the callback that you pass into .then is only invoked once you call resolve. So that's important. .then and resolve are linked very closely. So as soon as you call resolve, this function is called. Whatever you put into resolve comes out of the callback here. You can chain them by returning more data. It doesn't have to be another promise. It could be any data that just chains into the next .then and the next .then. You can chain these for infinity. So let's talk a little bit about async await. Async await is a way to make all of this look real pretty. So I'm going to copy this and I'm actually going to put it over here just so I have it. So what we do for async await is first of all we need a function. And I'm going to call it get teams for project. And this function needs a special keyword in front of it. It needs the async keyword. Oops. And you can see JavaScript recognizes that as a keyword. As soon as you put the async in front of a function, immediately magically returns a promise. So if I come in here and I say, okay, result equals get teams for project, even though you notice there's nothing in there, log result, and I run this, you can see it's a promise. It's an undefined promise. If I take away that async, it's just undefined. But with that async, it returns a promise by default. It's just a magical promise that comes out of it, which means as soon as you put async, you're entering promised land. And remember, once you get into promised land, you can never leave. So let's see what the first thing we want to do. Okay, let's do our call API promise. Let's actually just pull this whole thing into here. Okay, I'll take this whole thing and I'm going to pop it in here just so that this is all inside there. Then I'm going to call that function, get teams for project. Run that. Pretty much the same thing. Nothing much has changed. What's the point? Well, what's the point is now, instead of the dot then, we can do this. Okay, now if I only just change that one, right? Let me show you what happens. Exactly the same thing. Because what this await does, this await is very similar to calling dot then. If JavaScript hits this point, it's not going to immediately go on to line 16. It's going to, as the name says, wait. It's going to wait for that promise to be resolved. Now, wait a minute, you might be saying, that's not how JavaScript works. JavaScript's got the event-driven model that when you tell it, you've got that promise, you've got that callback, it leaves. It goes and does something else. Yeah, and it's actually still doing that here. It's just doing it under the hood. The reason they do this is because our code looks so much better. So again, I'm going to go and convert all of these to awaits, and I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. All right, so let's take a look. We get our user by calling await, and remember, await awaits for the promise to be done. Then we log. Then we get our settings by also calling await. We get our organizations by calling await, our units, our pillars, our teams, our projects, our members. This code looks clean. This code is nice. And it reads like it's running synchronously. But this await keyword is what tells JavaScript, hey, this isn't actually synchronous. We're just writing it like it is. The only reason async await works is so that we can write nicer looking code. So now we can actually pull these back in because we now have access to those objects. If we run this, you can see it runs exactly the same. So that is how async await works. An important thing to notice, let's say that we don't await this user. And we run this. It's still a promise. You have to await the promise in order for it actually to turn into a value. So that's really important. Just because you're in the magical async function doesn't mean that you can just get away with calling a promise function without the await. The await has to be there in every case. So now, what's the result of this? What's a promise? So we actually could say dot then all data loaded. And if we do that, you see it only fires this after this is done. So even if you have a function that's using async await, outside of that function, you can still call dot then on it because it's still returning a promise that you can wait. And even if I wanted to return some data, that still comes out here. So you see if I run that, now it has that foo here. So whatever you return out of the async await, it goes in to here. Okay. So now let's say that we actually had an error in one of these APIs. So let's say that one of these APIs just didn't work. It returned something wrong. Well, what we do for that in promises is we have a second parameter here, reject. So if I call reject on this, you see it actually gives me an error. It says this error, there's an unhandled promise rejection. This error originated by throwing inside of an async function without a catch or rejecting the promise which is not handled. And in this case, we rejected the promise. So instead of resolve, which calls .then, we rejected it. Let's pull this down here for a second. Now, how do we handle a promise rejection? Well, just like .then, we have a .catch. Long promise was rejected. Okay, we run this again, and you can see now we get the promise was rejected. So this, the .catch corresponds directly to the reject function, just like the .then corresponds to the resolve. Whatever callback function you put into .catch, it turns into, it gets the reject. Now here's the great thing about .catch, is you can put it at the end of the promise chain. So if I put this .catch here, and I run this, you see it runs promise was rejected, but it doesn't complain about these other ones here, even though it's at the very end. So if you put .catch on this chain, it'll catch any error thrown by any of these sleeps. Okay, so that's kind of powerful. It'll handle anywhere in that chain. So let's look at how we would add this to our promises 2 right here. So what I've done is I've added in a second callback into my call API, which is the error callback. So it's going to give me an error if there's any problems. So let's do this, error. And then what I want to do with that error, oopsie, is I want to reject. So similar to a resolve, where whatever you pass into resolve will show up in the .then. Whatever you pass into a reject shows up in the catch. So now if I run this, it says, hey, again, this error originated by throwing inside of an async function. Okay, so then I put a .catch at the end here, error, error fetching data, oops, error. If I run that now, it says, hey, error fetching data, error calling API. So now we've got error handling as well. So how do we handle that in our async await? Well, let's take a look. Let's copy this over here. Now if I run this one, oops, I need to actually pass the wrong username in, otherwise it doesn't fail. We get the same, throwing inside of an async function without a call catch block. So what we do here, we don't use a .catch, we actually use a try catch. So this is a standard JavaScript thing, catch, console error. This is a standard JavaScript thing for handling errors, and this works perfectly with async await. So if I put it in like this, try catch, you can see error calling API. And then it actually calls a .then. The reason is because we handled the error inside of here. We could also not catch the error and do a .catch on the end here, just like a normal promise. So, I know it was a lot of data, but that is promises in a nutshell. They are a little complicated, but what their job is to make things cleaner in our code. This may look messy, but it's better than this, and this is even better. So, I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them in the comments or shoot me a DM if you have access to that, and I'll see you in class.